March 1945. The stone corridor of a requisitioned schoolhouse in the Rhineland echoes with the shuffle of worn boots. Outside, the Rhine flows cold and indifferent beneath broken bridges. Inside, 32 women stand in a line that smells of sweat, fear, and the acrid residue of smoke still clinging to their wool uniforms. Their faces are pale, lips pressed tight. Some stare at the floor. Others hold their chins high, defiant even now, even here. Even as the door swings open, and an American sergeant steps through carrying a canvas, bag and a pair of barber's shears that catch the gray light from the window. The women are members of the Helferinnenkorps, the Women's Auxiliary Corps, captured during the final collapse of the WWII, Wehrmacht's Western Front. They had served as communications operators, clerks, searchlight crews, anti-aircraft auxiliaries. They wore the eagle and swastika on their sleeves. They had saluted the Führer. They had believed, with the fervor of the young and the certainty of the indoctrinated, that they were defending the fatherland from barbarism. Now they are prisoners. And now, in this cold room that smells of chalk dust and old wood, they are about to be stripped of more than their freedom. The shears make a metallic whisper as the sergeant opens them. The sound is small, but in the silence of that room, it is enormous. To understand what happens next, to understand the humiliation, the confusion, the smoldering rage and quiet shame that will follow these women for decades, we must first understand what they expected. The women of the Helferinnenkorps had been taught, through years of propaganda, that the Americans were a mongrel nation of gangsters and plutocrats, a people without culture or discipline, led by Jews and corrupted by Negroes and communists. They had been told that capture by the Western Allies meant dishonor, perhaps death. The propaganda had been less explicit about the Americans than about the Soviets. There were no stories of mass rape, no warnings of Siberian labor camps, but the message was clear. Surrender was betrayal, and betrayal would be punished. Yet even in the chaos of those final weeks, as the Reich crumbled and the front dissolved into a nightmare of retreat and rout, many of these women had clung to a different hope. They had heard rumors, whispered in bunkers and repeated in the back of trucks fleeing eastward, that the Americans were soft, that they treated prisoners well, that they had food, medicine, cigarettes, that they respected women. Some of the older women, those who remembered the Great War, spoke of American soldiers handing out chocolate to children in the Rhineland. Perhaps, they thought, it would not be so bad. Perhaps the propaganda had been exaggerated. Perhaps survival was possible. But they did not expect this. The first woman is called Forward. She is 19 years old, blonde hair braided and pinned beneath her field cap. Her name is Greta, though that detail will not appear in any official record. She steps forward because she is ordered to, because disobedience is unthinkable even now, even as a prisoner. The sergeant gestures to a wooden chair in the center of the room. She sits. Another soldier, a corporal with a Brooklyn accent and hands that smell of carbolic soap, removes her cap. Her braid uncoils, thick and golden, falling past her shoulders. She had grown it since she was a child. Her mother had brushed it every morning. The sergeant does not ask permission. He gathers the braid in one hand, lifts it away from her neck, and cuts. The shears crunch through the hair in 3 rough strokes. The braid falls to the floor like a dead snake. Greta does not cry. She does not move. But her hands, resting on her knees, curl into fists so tight that her knuckles turn white. One by one, the women are called forward. One by one, their hair is cut. Not shaved. This is not the brutal cropping of collaboration suspects in liberated France, not the public spectacle of vengeance, but cut short, crudely, without care. The Americans do not explain why. They do not speak except to give orders. Some of the women weep silently. Others close their eyes. A few, the youngest, tremble so badly that the soldiers must steady their heads to keep the shears from nicking skin. The hair piles up on the floor in drifts of brown and blonde and black, a soft mound that grows with each passing minute. When the cutting is finished, the sergeant opens his canvas bag and pulls out the armbands. The women have already surrendered their weapons, their identification papers, their field equipment, but the armbands remain, still stitched to their sleeves. The black swastika in a white circle on a red field, the symbol of the regime they served. The sergeant moves down the line with a knife, slicing the stitches, pulling the bands free. He tosses them into a metal drum in the corner of the room. When the drum is full, he pours gasoline over the cloth and strikes a match. The armbands burn with a chemical stink, the synthetic dyes releasing greasy black smoke that curls toward the ceiling. The women watch in silence. Some of them had sewn those armbands themselves. The historical record of this moment is fragmented, scattered across after-action reports, prisoner intake logs, and the private letters of soldiers who witnessed or participated in such procedures. The U.S. Army did not issue formal orders mandating the cutting of female prisoners' hair, nor did it prohibit the practice. What happened depended on the unit, the commander, the circumstances of capture. In some camps, women were processed without incident, their hair untouched, their dignity preserved as far as the chaos of war allowed. In others, particularly in the immediate aftermath of combat, the treatment was harsher. The rationale, when it was offered at all, was sanitary. Lice were endemic in the Wehrmacht, and short hair was easier to delouse. But the women did not experience it as a medical procedure. They experienced it as punishment, as humiliation, as a deliberate stripping away of femininity, of identity, of the last fragile remnants of who they had been. There is a photograph taken in April 1945 that survives in the National Archives. It shows a group of German women prisoners in a camp near Regensburg, their heads shorn, their faces blank. They are standing in a line, holding tin plates, waiting for food. The photograph is labeled Enemy POWs, Female Auxiliaries. It offers no names, no context, no explanation. But if you look closely, you can see the rawness of the scalps, the uneven cuts, the way some of the women are holding themselves, shoulders hunched, arms crossed, as if trying to disappear. The burning of the armbands was more systematic. Allied forces were under strict orders to confiscate and destroy all Nazi insignia. The swastika, the eagle, the runes of the SS. These were not merely symbols, but legal evidence of affiliation with a criminal regime. The Nuremberg trials were already being planned, and every scrap of documentation, every badge and banner, was potential evidence. But for the women standing in that schoolhouse, watching their armbands burn, the act carried a different weight. The armband had meant something. It had meant belonging. It had meant purpose. It had meant that they were part of something larger than themselves, something that promised order and strength and national rebirth. Now it was ash. The contrast between expectation and reality was never sharper than in those first days of captivity. The women had been taught to see the Americans as the enemy, but they had not been taught to see them as human. And now, suddenly, they were confronted with the mundane, bewildering humanity of their captors. The sergeant who cut Greta's hair was a barber from Ohio before the war. The corporal who held her head steady had 3 sisters back home in Brooklyn. The lieutenant who supervised the processing had a wife who wrote him letters about their baby daughter learning to walk. These men were not monsters. They were not sadists. They were tired, overworked soldiers doing a job in the middle of a war that had already gone on too long. But to the women, their captors seemed incomprehensible. The Americans were casual in a way that felt like disrespect. They chewed gum. They smoked constantly. They joked with each other in English that sounded harsh and nasal. They did not stand at attention when an officer entered the room. They treated the women not with the cruelty the propaganda had promised, but with a kind of indifferent efficiency that was, in its own way, more disorienting. The Americans did not hate them. The Americans barely thought about them at all. And then there was the food. The women had been hungry for months. The Wehrmacht's supply lines had collapsed, and rations had dwindled to black bread and thin soup. Some of them had not eaten meat in weeks. So when the Americans brought in crates of sea rations, canned stew, crackers, powdered coffee, chocolate bars, the women could not reconcile the abundance with their understanding of the world. They had been told that America was a land of exploitation, where workers starved while capitalists grew fat. They had been told that the American war effort was unsustainable, that the nation was on the verge of economic collapse. But here, in this makeshift prison camp, the food kept coming. The Americans threw away half-full cans. They fed their prisoners better than the Wehrmacht had fed its own soldiers. One woman, a former radio operator named Ilse, would later write in her memoir that the chocolate was the worst part. Not because it tasted bad, it tasted better than anything she had eaten in years, but because it shattered something inside her. How could they have so much, she wrote, and still be the enemy? The question haunted her. It haunted many of them. The transformation did not happen all at once. It came in fragments, in small moments that accumulated over days and weeks. It came in the realization that the guards, for all their casual arrogance, were not going to rape them. It came in the discovery that the camp had a medical tent staffed by doctors who treated German prisoners with the same care they gave to American soldiers. It came in the Red Cross packages, the clean water, the latrines that did not overflow. It came, most of all, in the slowly dawning understanding that the Americans had not lied about who they were. The propaganda had lied. This was not a comfortable realization. For many of the women, it meant confronting the possibility that everything they had believed, everything they had sacrificed for, had been a lie. It meant asking questions that had no good answers. If the Americans were not the monsters they had been taught to fear, then what did that make the regime they had served? If the Allies were not the aggressors, then who was? If the war had not been a defensive struggle for survival, then what had it been? Some of the women refused to engage with these questions. They clung to their beliefs, insisting that the Americans were simply better at propaganda, that the kindness was a trick, that the real truth would emerge eventually. Others retreated into silence, into a kind of numb acceptance that asked nothing and expected nothing. But a few, a small, stubborn few, began to change. They began to see their captors not as enemies, but as people. They began to see themselves not as victims of Allied cruelty, but as participants in a catastrophe they had helped to create. Greta, the girl with the golden braid, was one of the ones who changed. Years later, in an interview with a German historian, she would describe the cutting of her hair as the moment she began to wake up. "It was not the worst thing that happened in the war," she said. "It was not even the worst thing that happened to me. But it was the first time I felt ashamed. Not because of what they did, but because of what I had done. Because I had worn that armband. Because I had believed the symbolic weight of hair cannot be overstated. In every culture, in every era, hair has been a marker of identity, status, sexuality, power. For women, especially, hair has carried meanings that go beyond the merely aesthetic. Long hair is femininity. Short hair is rebellion, or punishment, or mourning. The shearing of a woman's hair is an ancient act of humiliation, repeated across centuries. The adulteress, the collaborator, the heretic. The Americans who cut the hair of German women prisoners may not have been conscious of this history, but the women were. They felt it in their bodies, in the sudden lightness of their heads, in the way their necks felt exposed and vulnerable. But hair also grows back. This too is symbolic. The women who walked out of those camps in the summer of 1945, their heads still shorn, their armbands burned, were not the same women who had walked in. They carried scars, some visible, most not, but they also carried the stubborn, undeniable fact of survival. They had expected to be destroyed. They had not been. They had expected cruelty. They had found indifference, efficiency, and occasional kindness. They had expected to remain loyal to the regime until death. Instead, they had been forced to confront the possibility that loyalty, too, could be a lie. The burning of the armbands was meant to be final, a symbolic severing of the prisoners from the ideology they had served. But symbols are not so easily destroyed. Some of the women would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget what the armband had meant. Others would cling to it, nursing resentment and grievance, insisting that they had been wronged. And a few, just a few, would come to see the burning not as a humiliation, but as a liberation. They burned the armband, one woman wrote years later, but they could not burn the memory of what I had done, that I had to burn myself. The American guards who carried out these procedures did not think of themselves as instruments of ideological transformation. They thought of themselves as soldiers doing a job, processing prisoners, maintaining order, getting through another day in a war that seemed like it would never end. They did not hate the women. They did not pity them. They simply wanted to go home. But in their casual, unthinking efficiency, they enacted a kind of truth that the women could not ignore. The truth of American abundance, American power, American indifference. The Americans did not need to humiliate their prisoners to assert dominance. They had already won. The chocolate, the sea rations, the clean water. These were not gestures of kindness. They were simply the baseline, the ordinary reality of a nation that could afford to feed its enemies better than the Reich had fed its own people. This was the deeper humiliation, the one that cut more deeply than any shears. The women had been raised to believe in German superiority, in the strength and discipline and purity of the Aryan race. They had been taught that they were warriors in a cosmic struggle, defending civilization against decadence and decay. And now they were prisoners, shorn and defeated, eating American food and sleeping under American blankets. And the Americans did not even care. The Americans were already thinking about the next problem, the next war, the next enemy. The women of the Helferinnenkorps were simply a logistical detail, a footnote in a campaign that had already moved on. The epilogue to this story is written in the lives the women lived after the war. Some of them married American soldiers and emigrated to the United States, leaving Germany behind forever. Others returned to the ruins of their homeland and spent decades rebuilding, never speaking of the war, never mentioning the armband or the shearing or the camps. A few became activists, educators, witnesses, determined that the next generation would not make the same mistakes. And some, a quiet minority, never recovered. They carried the shame and the confusion and the unresolved grief until it consumed them. But all of them, every single one, carried the memory of that moment in the schoolhouse. The sound of the shears, the smell of burning wool, the weight of the hair falling away. It was not the worst thing that happened in the war. It was not even close. But it was the moment when the lie became visible, the moment when the ideology cracked, the moment when they understood, perhaps for the first time, that they had been on the wrong side of history. There is a passage in one of the letters, written by an American chaplain who visited the women's camps in the spring of 1945. He wrote about a conversation he had with a young German woman, a former auxiliary who had been captured near the Rhine. She asked him why the Americans were being kind to them. He told her it was because Americans believed in human dignity, even for enemies. She looked at him for a long time, and then she said, "We were never taught that enemies could be human." The chaplain did not record his response. Perhaps he had none? Perhaps there was no response that could bridge the gulf between what she had been taught and what she was learning. But the question lingered, as it lingers still, as it must linger for anyone who seeks to understand the terrible chemistry of belief and disillusionment, of ideology and its aftermath. The women who were shorn and stripped of their armbands in the spring of 1945 were not innocent. They had served a criminal regime. They had worn its symbols. They had believed its lies. But they were also human, young, capable of change. The cutting of their hair was a small cruelty in a war that had been built on cruelties beyond measure. But it was also, in its own strange way, a beginning, the beginning of a reckoning, the beginning of a transformation, the beginning of the long, painful process of learning that the world was not what they had been told, and that they, too, had been complicit in the lie. The hair grew back. The scars did not. But perhaps that is the price of waking up. Perhaps that is the cost of freedom. To see yourself clearly, to understand what you have done, and to carry that knowledge forward, into whatever comes next. The women who walked out of those camps in the summer of 1945 walked into a world that had been burned down and rebuilt, a world that had no more use for armbands or eagles or the comforting lies of certainty. They walked into a world that demanded they be more than they had been, that they reckon with the past and choose, day by day, to be something different. The shears have rusted. The armbands are ash. But the memory endures, a small shard of history, sharp and bright and necessary, because some things must be remembered, even when, especially when, they hurt.